We are back with another episode of Mission Control, the Bellwether Enterprise Podcast. This episode is the second of a two-part series we recorded in Denver, Colorado with Anthea Martin, a Senior Vice President at Bellwether Enterprise. The first episode featured Anthea and Bellwether Transaction Manager Colleen Basil discussing the topic of women in commercial real estate. Like all episodes of Mission Control, that episode can be found on the Bellwether Enterprise YouTube channel and on all podcast platforms. For this episode, Anthea shares a little about her background and how she got into the business. We also discuss the current state of affordable housing, what it looks like today, and the impact an increase in funds and supportive policy dedicated to the expansion of affordable housing can have.
I was born and raised in New York City. I grew up in New York in the 80s. And during the 80s, there were, about 25,000 homeless people who were put out into the streets. So I was a latchkey kid and honestly was just very affected by seeing that number of mentally ill homeless people in the streets at such a young age, and always had a heart for those less fortunate. And so ended up going to NYU, ended up at the business school. I wanted to go into sociology, but ended up in the business school because my father wanted me to be honest.
Hey, there you
go. That's the truth.
Ended up working out pretty well.
Yeah, it did. So majored in marketing and information systems and wanted to be a web designer, but the .com crash happened, and so that didn't work out for me, and had landed an internship randomly at Lehman Brothers and had a really good experience being exposed to CMBS at the time, and worked there for a couple of years while I was a student. When I graduated, I had made some connections with another company out here in Denver, Northmark Capital, and worked there as an analyst and very much focused on the market rate side of the business, also a lot more of the conventional side, and knew that I wanted to do something with a bit more of a purpose. And so had a unique opportunity to work on a HUD contract with a HUD PAE, a participating administrating entity, and worked on the mark-to-market program. So traveled weekly and restructured about 35 HUD Section 8 projects through the mark-to-market program. And through that experience, I was able to meet with the residents. I had to meet with the residents to see what items they wanted to be improved, upgraded, to get some feedback from them on the management company. And also then ultimately went and underwrote all of those deals. So I was a HUD underwriter ultimately. And it was at that point where I really saw that there was I could create this synergy between my passion for helping others, specifically the homeless or those less fortunate, with my experience in the commercial real estate industry, which I really enjoyed what I had experienced up until that point. So in short, I've been on the underwriting side for about 16 years. Most recently, I was at CBRE as a senior MAP underwriter, was there for about 5 years, and transitioned as an originator. Worked at Walker & Dunlop for a couple of years. A great platform to focus on the sales side of the business, but very much market rate focused, where I really want it to be more on the affordable housing side.
Sure.
And Bellwether Enterprise just has an amazing toolbox for affordable housing. Great synergies with enterprise communities, being that they're a majority owner and they're a nonprofit, so we're truly capital on a mission. I loved what Bellwether stood for, the values of the company. Debbie Rogan was, I found a video on her, and I love that she's on she was a co-founder of the company and also part of the executive team, and really wanted to work for a company where there were strong women. So Bellwether's been a great fit for me.
So your perspective on being a Hispanic woman in the industry, and you kind of mentioned before we launched on fired up the mics, just about what it took for you to kind of get to where you are, because you were such a small percentage of individuals in the industry. You had mentioned a little bit about your outlook on things personally, and how that kind of helped propel you to do what you do now, I guess.
Sure. Good question. So production in general is I'd say more of a vulnerable role for anybody. You're really putting yourself out there. You are a brand. Your company is as well, but you really are a brand as well. And when I initially started off in production, it was like drinking out of a fire hose. It was honestly, a lot of personal growth has gone into it. Initially, I felt really different because most of my colleagues were all men, and they were white men.
Right.
And And so I felt like I stuck out like a sore thumb, and it made it more difficult for me to succeed in what I was doing because I was too focused on how I was different. And something shifted at some point where instead of feeling like I was different, I started feeling like, you know what? Maybe my difference is my superpower. Sure. Maybe that's what's going to make me even more successful, is the fact that I am a woman. And on top of that, I'm a Hispanic female. And so maybe they'll remember me, remember my phone call or remember meeting with me differently than they might remember meeting with somebody else. And so just shifting that perspective was huge for me. And it's amazing when you it's all about attitude. Life in general is about attitude, but sales especially is about attitude because people pick up on how you're feeling. Yeah. And so that shift really, once that happened, I felt like everything clicked for me in production.
Gotcha. You can kind of just explain what is affordable housing, because I'm sure there's a lot of varieties, and whether it's West Coast, East Coast, all different types of things. Just kind of what affordable housing really is.
Sure. Yeah, because there's so many different types of affordable housing, especially now when there's a huge buzz around workforce housing as well. So traditional affordable housing, I'd say, let's just go back 30 years ago. If you asked me what affordable housing was then, I would tell you, Section 8 housing, where you're dealing with 30% area median income, which is AMI. So dealing with individuals who make 30% of AMI, the Section 8 housing supported those individuals. And that would be what historically public housing or Section 8 housing was. And it's taken a long time for society as a whole to get comfortable with what affordable housing is today, because it is very different. You're serving a very different type of population. So the 30% area median income AMI individuals are considered very low income, very vulnerable individuals. And the 60% AMI is considered more of your service workers, your teachers, your policemen, just individuals that we need in our community. And that, frankly, make about 60% of AMI and are struggling to live in areas such as Denver because rents have gone up so quickly and income has not gone up with it. So 60% AMI is what affordable housing would be considered today, 60% AMI and below. Most of the tools that are out there, including the LIHTC program, the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, really targets the 60% AMI. That's where the deals pencil the best in most markets today. And then now we have something new, which is more of called the missing middle or the workforce housing. It's really between 60% AMI and wherever the market is. So in Denver, let's just say it's at 150% of AMI. That 60 to 150% AMI is considered the workforce housing or the missing middle. And there really are not many tools to fill that need because there are no tax credit programs out there. However, there are now some programs with the agencies that offer better terms for that type of housing. And we have a lot of local government agencies as well as nonprofits nationally and locally that are creating funds to help fill that gap for that 60 to 150% AMI. In terms of what these apartments would look like, so a Section 8, 30% AMI versus maybe workforce housing, 80% AMI. The workforce housing is going to be more of a mixed income project. So it might look a little bit more like a typical market rate project. Whereas a Section 8 project that maybe has 100% of the units at 30% AMI have historically been more like public housing developments. Sure. And those have been built in communities. And that type of development has proven to be unsuccessful because what you're doing is grouping a huge population, let's just say 300 residents, all making 30% AMI, so all living, very low income in the same community. So it tended to be a huge hub for drugs, et cetera, and crime. And so now what we're seeing more of is the trend for mixing income, giving people opportunity because it's been proven that you have more opportunity when you're living with people of higher wealth. Yeah, just so let's say a property has X number of units, there'll be a percentage of those that will be affordable dedicated and a percentage that are just regular. Is that how that kind of works Exactly. Out? And now with the IRS has passed a change to the code where they're allowing for income averaging. And so traditionally where you could have a tax credit deal that was 60% AMI, now you can mix some 30 and 50% AMI units with some 70% AMI units as long as it averages out to the 60% AMI.
Gotcha. I know there's some different, things that are going on within the market here locally and in Colorado and everything like that. I guess speak a little on those, and then I understand you're a part of some different, community-based programs. If you can kind of speak on those as well. I think give a little bit background on some boards and things that you participate on.
Sure. This has been a great legislative session for Colorado. We've been fighting for more dollars towards affordable housing for decades now. And this year, we're going to see $7 million of additional funding for affordable housing. And then next year, it's going to be about $45 million. And that's for the next 5 years.
Awesome.
So a lot more funding. And that's on top of the funding that we already had in place. And since marijuana was legalized in Colorado, we've had about $15 million from the tax of marijuana that went straight to permanent supportive housing or for housing for the homeless, as well as other programs and initiatives. So we have seen a huge increase in the amount of funding that's available. And that's great because all of these deals are getting more and more expensive to build.
Right.
And as the cost increase, then the gap increases in the capital stack as well.
Yeah.
So that's been helping to fill that. And in terms of my involvement, I'm on the board of Housing Colorado, which is a statewide advocacy and industry group for affordable housing. Been involved with Housing Colorado for decades, and it's just a great platform. I was also recently appointed to the State Housing Board last fall, and that has been a fantastic experience.
So you mentioned a minute ago about some additional funding coming along. What kind of impact long-term do you see, and kind of short-term and long-term, as some of those funds come more available here locally and within the state? Kind of what impact on affordable housing do you see that really making in the grand scheme of things?
Sure. Well, in Colorado, we're in a housing crisis. About 1 in every 5 Coloradans is experiencing housing instability. That means that they're paying more than 30% of their income on housing. Wow. And with all these funds that come in, assuming that everything else stays the same, we would achieve housing stability in about year 2055. Oh, wow. So it's the first time that we've ever seen a light at the end of the tunnel. The biggest challenge that we still have is bond cap allocation. So we don't have enough bond cap to support all of those deals that are working. So for example, there may be 45 applications that get submitted to CHAFA, which is our housing finance agency, and they're only able to approve 20 of those, which means that you have sites and development teams all lined up to get these 60% AMI or affordable deals out of the ground, and they're not able to because there's not enough bond cap. So even though we have gap financing sources, the biggest benefit to those gap financing sources is that we're going to be able to see more of the lower income, which is our biggest need. Statistically, if you look at the 30 and 50% AMI, that's where the biggest need is. So that gap funding will really help to build more of those units, which tend to have much of a bigger gap in their capital stacks. And it's also going to help fund certainly the 60% AMI deals, but the workforce housing deals as well, which end up having a decent size gap.
Well, I think that more or less wraps it up. Thank you again for sitting down with me.
Thank you.
It's been a great conversation. Hopefully come back out here soon. We'll
come
sit down
visit us.
again.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks.